Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the W. Brent Bergen Lunch and Learn series. It's good to see a bunch of people in-house for the lecture, and I know there's quite a few people out in, I call it cyberspace, who are tuning in as well to our Zoom. Couple of announcements. Next month, we will have Claudia Hyman-Priest, who teaches the Catawba language and English here on campus. She's got a lecture on environmental racism, injustice, and inequity. And that'll be on Friday, July 15th, as always, at noon here at the center and in cyberspace. On August 19th, we're real pleased. We're going to introduce you to the new Native American Studies historian. As many of you know, Brooke Bauer left for Tennessee. They cherry-picked her. We're going to catch up with them eventually. But Dr. Evan New is our new historian. He'll be joining us on August 15th, and 4 days later, he'll be doing a lunch and learn, making the Hampton Massacre, Native Resistance, Settler Memory, and White Solidarity in South Carolina. So come out and meet and see our new historian. Today, we're very fortunate to have a man that I have just met for the first time, but I think everyone in this town knows him. Dr. Jim Farmer, as a lot of you know, was here at Lancaster, teaching history here on campus, and left for Aiken, where he retired from. And he is a native of North Carolina, has degrees from East Carolina University and the University of South Carolina, a student of both Southern and South Carolina history. He and his wife Judy moved to Spartanburg in 2016. They have 2 daughters and 4 above average grandchildren. We all have above average, right? And thanks to this project, Dr. Farmer jokes that he feels that he's expanded his knowledge on South Carolina public health and history from a 2 to 5 on a scale of 1 to 10. So please give a nice welcome for Dr. Jim Farmer.
Good to see a healthy turnout, and to you folks who are looking at me, but I can't see you, I hope you'll feel just as much part of it as people that are here in person. My able assistant is going to point out to me that it is when it gets to be 12:40, and I'm going to wrap up with maybe a little 5-minute compacted summary and then open the floor. And I'm going to be very disappointed if you're not ready with some questions. In fact, if you want to interrupt me in the process, if I say something that triggers a thought in your mind, you're afraid you might not remember it later, I don't mind you raising your hand and asking. Maybe I'll give you a somewhat perfunctory response, but anyway, that's perfectly fine with me as well. It is true that I have risen from a level 2 to level 5 on a scale of 1 to 10 in what I know about healthcare in this state, but only to a 5. And I say that so that your expectations won't get too out of hand as far as what you're going to hear me talk about. Of course, I have 0 medical knowledge. I don't even know how to talk to my doctors intelligently about what they say is wrong with me. So don't expect that kind of a presentation either. But I'm going to share a quick little personal aside that only occurred to me recently. My career is coming full circle today. My first real teaching experience was in student teaching as a senior in college, and I was assigned to a 9th grade civics class in Kinston, North Carolina. I showed up, met my supervising professor. He showed me the civics textbook. This was probably in April. And he said, we've already covered the first 10 chapters. You know, the basic structure of the American government, Constitution, the amendments, checks and balances, evolution of powers, and so forth. All the stuff that I was really primed to do because I was a political science minor. Here's the chapter he said that you're going to be taking when you get out. The government and health and safety. What does the government do for us in the areas of health and safety? And these were 9th graders. So this was my baptism of fire, trying to make it interesting to them. And I don't really think I succeeded, actually. But now here I am back, below these many years later, talking about something that's at least vaguely familiar, but vaguely similar. And this is probably going to be my swan song, not today, hopefully, but I don't expect to do any more big projects in the time that I'm allotted. But I've gotten a lot out of it. I'll be honest with you, when I was asked by Robert Folks several years ago to take this project on, I was nonplussed. I was not thrilled. He prevailed upon me, and I'm pretty good at rationalizing, saying, you know, maybe it won't be as bad as I'm thinking it will be, but it really hasn't. I want to say a little bit about the Aris Foundation, who I have been doing this project for. And as you may have seen in the little flyer that was put out here, the famous phrase, "What is past is prologue," is on there. I've got a little joke for you. Those words are chiseled into the facade of the National Archives building in Washington, D.C., as well as other places. But the story goes that a visitor to Washington was being ridden around town by a cab driver, and they came down the street where the archive was, and he looked up there and he read that, and he said, "What does that mean?" The cab driver said, "I think it means you ain't seen nothing yet." Kind of works with Washington, doesn't it? Anyway, wouldn't be a decent historian if I didn't think that the past is valuable as a teacher of other people's experiences and maybe some lessons that we can put to work. It's very easy to get into the issue of health and public health if you want to do it the way everybody is doing it these days. And I found this by Googling healthiest communities in America, and lo and behold, you can't read it, but that's the title of the website. You know, people are making lists all the time. So we found out what were the 20 healthiest communities in the country this year. Next year, they'll, you know, rejuggle it. But if you look at the characteristics of those communities, the strengths that they have, reasons that they are considered the healthiest, and then flip that over, you're on your way to understanding the history of healthcare in this state. That sounds harsh. And I know we have some places that might actually be on it. Well, I don't think I saw any South Carolina communities on that list. But in any case, it's not that hard to begin to get a sense of what constitutes the conditions under which people can expect to maximize their health. We've got a long way to go. As I said to somebody soon after I got started on this project, this is the gloomiest thing I've ever worked on. It's easy to just get depressed. And what I've decided to do today, for the most part, is to share that depressing news with you. Now, I will just say that there is some good news tucked in there as you begin to go through the material that's available. And I've got a couple of things that I hope I'm going to remember to put in just to kind of show you that it wasn't all gloom and doom. But the overwhelming story is not inspiring. Okay, where are my specs? I can get along with that one, but they were right up here. Did you get my glasses? I believe that is them. Well, what I have done up until this point, for the most part, partly because COVID made it impossible for me to do anything else, is to sit at my computer at home, read books, do some online research, and compile a history of healthcare in the state of South Carolina. And I consider that to be the context for what will be coming and what has already started, but still has a long way to go, which is the history of healthcare in Lancaster County and the towns of Great Falls and Fort Long, which is the service area of the Harris Foundation. So that's the rationale for the project. I thought about trying to include some Lancaster County material this morning, but as I looked over it, I realized that really what it will seem like is a scattered a table full of scattered jigsaw puzzle pieces, and trying to stitch them together into a coherent narrative is really beyond us at this point. So I'm going to save that for another time. But maybe I can bring anybody back and talk much more on a local level. But that, of course, Springs Industries, Springs Mills. The big event that comes to mind when you think about modern healthcare in Lancaster is the J. Marion Sims Hospital, which opened, I believe, in 1940, and then updated by the Springs Hospital in 1970. I'm going to talk about the cultural background against which we can get a better understanding of healthcare in this state. And I'm going to focus on two groups. You probably already know that. You're beginning to get an idea. The two groups that are both the largest ethnic populations in our state and also the most critically affected by the circumstances that would lead to poor health care. And I'm talking about African Americans and white cotton mill workers. Fortunately, both of those groups have been the subject of massive amounts of study by historians of race, slavery, and segregation, and by historians of class and industrialization and mill communities. So there's no problem finding information about both of them. There's another group that would be nice to know something about too in terms of healthcare, and that was the even larger number of white and Black sharecroppers and tenant farmers who were scattered all over the state. They existed before the Civil War, but their numbers grew exponentially after the Civil War. And they were a part of our culture until a little after World War II. Into the 1950s, you begin to see sharecropping pretty much disappear. The New Deal actually dealt a heavy blow to sharecropping, whether that's a blessing or a curse is up to discussion. But the problem with studying sharecroppers is they have never been studied collectively and really cannot be, because they weren't in one place like the mill villages, and they weren't this whole category that is, just unavoidable when you think about Southern history, the slaves and then ex-slaves going through the travails of Jim Crow, disfranchisement, second-class citizenship, and so forth. So those are the two groups that I've been focusing on. And I'm going to talk about the first group first and then the second group second. Two questions that the leaders of the state asked themselves. One, at the very outset of the founding of the colony, how are we going to become prosperous in this remote frontier environment that we have chosen to relocate in? 1670, little Charlestown community spreading out along the coast in both directions. They knew they had to have a crop. The first key to their economic success was trading with the Indians. That worked somewhat, but it also created huge tensions because the Indians felt they were being cheated, and that led to conflict, and that led to warfare and the decimation of the Indians. I was going to mention DeSoto, but I'll leave him alone. So the Indian slave trade is not going to be the key. They thought about enslaving Indians and using them as agricultural workers. You see, South Carolina could look to Virginia and see that there was already a colony that was growing massive amounts of tobacco using Black slaves and white indentured servants. So that might be a model, but we've got these natives. Let's see if we can make them work for us on the plantations. No, that did not work. Main reason, they could escape too easily back to the tribal headquarters and dare you to come try to find it. So The answer was, let's use African slaves like they're doing in Virginia. But tobacco is probably not going to be our ticket. Let's try some other crops. And long story short, they settled on rice and as a backup crop, indigo. So by the middle of the 1700s, South Carolina was, by all mutual agreement of those who have studied it, the richest colony in British North America. It was made that way by the growing and exportation of rice and indigo with massive numbers of slaves. It wasn't long before slaves outnumbered white people. That came about 1710. By the time of the Revolution, there were twice as many blacks as whites in South Carolina. And if you confine yourself just to the low country plantations, the ratio was more like 9 to 1, 9 out of every 10. It's hard to imagine being a white family being surrounded by that many blacks and being able to sleep at night. That's another whole subject, but that's what it was. Great wealth. A great economic historian, a friend of mine named Peter Kirklandis at the University of North Carolina, has calculated that the average worth of the population of St. Philip's Parish, which is downtown Charleston, around the time of the American Revolution, was over 5,000 pounds sterling. And I cannot translate that into 2020 dollars, but suffice it to say, it was a huge amount of money and much more than the comparable figure would have been for Virginia, Massachusetts, or anything else. How can we sustain that? How can we keep this thing going? How can future generations enjoy this kind of prosperity? Well, we've got to hold on to the system of slavery. So once that system comes under scrutiny and under protest and demands for its end, South Carolinians get increasingly nervous. The Civil War, to put it in a nutshell, since we started it by seceding from the Union and by firing on Fort Sumter, it was a result of anxiety on the part of wealthy planners about the threat to their economic and social welfare, represented by the rise of a new political party, the Republican Party, in 1850. Now, what does all this have to do with health? Well, the Low Country was, as someone has said, a petri dish of pathogens that were thriving from May to October and November. Somebody said Charleston was a paradise in the spring, hell in the summer, and a hospital in the fall. Maybe it should have been the other way around. Anyway, that's the way the expression was. If you could afford to, and you lived in Charleston, you headed to the upcountry when the weather heated up. If you lived on a plantation, you at least came into town where the breezes would come across the peninsula and make it a little bit more bearable than where you were out there on your rice plantation. The slaves did not have that option. They stayed there year-round and they worked very hard. We eliminated the picture on the man standing knee-deep in the mud. Yeah. Not only did they have to grow the rice, they had to maintain the rice fields. And that involves every year sort of rebuilding dikes, readjusting the flow of the tidal rivers so that the fields can be flooded just at the right time. Huge physical labor. White people thought that the cruelty of that was not what we might think it was, because they thought that Africans brought with them immunities or resistance, at least, to yellow fever and malaria, the two most deadly, most troublesome diseases that people in the Low Country were subject to. That is not literally true, but it was a convenient understanding, and there seemed to be something to it in the statistical aspect of surviving on the plantations, white people versus black people. They never tried white labor on a large scale, so we can't say whether white people would have died in those circumstances or not, but they were comfortable with the idea that nature did not intend people who look like us to do that kind of work. Now, when we get into the health aspects of slavery, we get into a controversial subject. I brought a book here that has been a great help to me. Its title is Doctoring the South, and the subtitle is Southern Physicians and Everyday Medicine in the mid-19th Century. And this guy, Stephen Stowe, happen to be acquainted with him, as professor at the University of Indiana, has gone through the records of hundreds of physicians who worked in the southern states during the antebellum period. And they were interested in Blacks because oftentimes they would be out on plantations thanks to a call from a master who had some sick slaves and he was worried about them. So he called a physician to come by and check up on them. And these people kept meticulous records of what they were trying to do, the medicine they used, what they thought was wrong with the patient, and so forth. So from those kind of data, you can get a sense of what specific health issues were so troublesome for Blacks. And we can say a few things with certainty. One is that their infant mortality rate was much higher than whites. That's easy to document. Planters were interested in keeping track of how many slave babies died. That was money out of their pocket, if you want to be crude about it. And they were also, if they had any sense, willing to allow pregnant slave women some time off prenatal and postnatal, not more time than was absolutely necessary, but they didn't work them right up to the delivery day and put them right out in the fields a week later. In spite of that, for various reasons, we can't really know because this is a private matter, little Black babies were dying at several times the rate of little white babies. Now, this I thought was kind of interesting, and this may be disputable, but I think Stephen So would say there's a consensus that once people got up to the age of 15 or so, the life expectancy of Blacks was as good as whites. You may not know this, but white people in the South in the 19th century were dying in huge numbers as well. The mortality rate of adult white people was very high. You don't have to study Southern history very long to realize that families who had maybe 8 children would only end up with 4 as adults. And you read some very painful letters about, mothers who lost a child, writing to friends and so forth, or even older in life. The most serious disease that Blacks had to deal with was typhoid, tuberculosis, cholera, and even the 2 that I mentioned that they were supposed to be immune to or resistant to. Let me look here and see. Now, just a second or two on another question that I think fascinates me anyway. What were the health consequences of emancipation? I'm sorry to report, they were not good. Actually, the death rate of Blacks in South Carolina in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, we think, was higher than it had been under slavery. Now, why would that be? Any thoughts? Well, think about the owner of the slaves and concern he had about the welfare of his people, and the lack of that after freedom. No one is checking on them. No one is looking after them. No one is concerned about them other than themselves, their relatives, their neighbors. They're on their own. They're illiterate. They're ignorant. All they know is to farm, and that's pretty much all they were doing for the most part, except those who lived in Charleston. And they were dying in alarming numbers. So much so, believe me when I say this, it was conventional wisdom among doctors in the late 1800s that the Black race was headed to extinction. Their numbers are shrinking to that degree. We're not sure they'll be around 50 years from now. In 1910, the American Medical Association held its annual meeting in Jacksonville, Florida. That was the subject on the agenda. What is the health condition of Blacks in this country? And what, if anything, can we do about it? One delegate said, I think we should do nothing. Why should we lift a finger to interfere with the course of nature? What was he saying? These people are inferior. They can't do for themselves. We can't afford to do for them. Let's let nature take its course. That proposal was voted down, I had to be able to tell you, by the body. But it was not an of the box idea at that time. Now, I want to shift to the cotton mill workers, but I don't want to leave anything really crucial out. So give me a second. Okay, I'm going to move to something kind of in between question number one and question number two. Is anybody itching to ask a question about anything I've said at this point? Very superficial. Sorry. Well, it doesn't turn dramatically, but when we see the most significant change is in the 1930s because of New Deal programs to get the country out of depression. Now, those programs were not exactly colorblind because they were administered on the state level. They were funded on the federal level, but it was state officials that were administering them. And it's plain as day when you look at, hold up, exhibit number 2, this book by, you remember Ed Beardsley? That this is Ed Beardsley's greatest contribution to Southern history anyway, A History of Neglect, Health Care for Blacks and Mill Workers in the 20th Century South. When I found this book, you think I was happy? This has been my Bible for the last couple of years. And I say in the written version of I'm going to call it my book, whatever it's going to turn out to be. This whole chapter, basically, that I'm getting ready to have you read, comes from this book. Yes, sir.
I got a question about, do you put the mortality rates way lower in the South and the North?
Mortality rates? I don't think we know the answer. And that sounds like a cop-out, but let me tell you something that was coming, it will be coming up in a few minutes. I'll go ahead and tell you now. Until 1915, the state of South Carolina did not collect vital statistics on anybody. The doctors in this state had been begging the legislature since at least the 1870s, pass a law mandating collecting vital statistics so we can have some data to prioritize our medical services, go where the need is great. We don't even know. Now, mortality, we have a little bit more information about that, but believe it or not, it was not unusual for a Black person to die well into the 20th century and there be no report, no documents filed at the courthouse, anything like that. In the North, I would like to think, and I assume it was probably better, but there again, we'd be speculating if we tried to answer this. It's a good question. It's always good to compare North and South. I've got some comparisons about mill workers in Massachusetts and mill workers in South Carolina. You might say it's an unfair comparison because Massachusetts was in that business almost a century before we got into it. But comparisons, I think, are still worth noticing. Okay, I've got now a list of 8 background factors, is what I call it, that help us to understand better the problem of trying to improve healthcare in this state. First is the environment. I've already talked about that, and I don't really think I need to say anymore. I'll give you one statistic that Walter Edgar had in his South Carolina history book. Between 1720 and 1750, in Charleston, there were 2,883 burials and 863 baptisms. And that's white people. Did you get those numbers? 2,883 burials, 863 baptisms. We're talking about the extinction of the Black race a minute ago. This is a trajectory that's going to lead to the extinction of the white population in South Carolina. Obviously, that didn't continue. And those numbers may not be totally accurate either, but it emphasizes the dangerous environment that they were living in. The second background point is the sad state of medical knowledge and available technologies that doctors had at their disposal. There was a very small amount of help that doctors could render, especially in some diseases, simply because of their ignorance and the lack of the kind of facilities that we associate with modern hospitals today. That began to change around 1900, and the whole 20th century has seen the arc of medical knowledge and technology go up and up. But as that has happened, it has become more costly, and South Carolina provided very little funding, and this was shocking to me. There is an institution called the Medical College of South Carolina, right? Well, now the Medical University of South Carolina. It's a misnomer. It was not the state hospital. It was a public/private hospital in Charleston, funded probably more by private contributions than by the state legislature. That did not begin to change until about 1950. I've got a picture of Roper Hospital up here. Let's see. Let's go ahead. Okay, I'm pushing the go forward button. Nothing's happening. Is this it right here? Yeah.
There you
All right. That's the best hospital that we had in South Carolina in 1850. And I think there's still a hospital by this name in Charleston now. It's Roper Hospital. It was named for the man who gave the money to build it. One individual funded that hospital. And the faculty at the college, medical college, had privileges at this hospital. And then, of course, the other physicians in Charleston. Then about 1950, they built what they call New Roper, replacing this building. I'm gonna make another preposterous statement. Until 1890, that was the only hospital in this state. Columbia had its first hospital in 1890, and that's the state capital. Of course, it was only maybe 10 or 12,000 people at the time. Doctors around the rest of, I'm getting to my next point, so I'll stop with that. My next point, the rural settlement pattern of this state. If you forget Charleston, there were no towns in South Carolina worth mentioning until after the Revolution. There was a place called Camden, there was a place called Beaufort, there was a place called Georgetown. There were little collections of people. They didn't have the critical mass to do what towns and cities normally are expected to do. Only Charleston had that. So if you were a typical South Carolinian up until the 20th century, you lived way out in the boonies, far too far away from a doctor to get to you in an emergency. And you had to rely on yourself, your neighbors, maybe a midwife or a root doctor that you might be familiar with. And we can question whether that medical care was anything more than rudimentary. In fact, it might have even been done more harm than good. Now, the good part about that is, flip side, epidemics were rare in the interior. You don't have the critical mass, you don't have the communicable disease factor. So people are getting sick in bunches in Charleston. People in the interior were healthier as far as contagious diseases are concerned. Now I've got a statistic on Lancaster County. I guess it's the same size now as it was then. 555 square miles, 2 doctors in 1850 that we know of. And of course, they were here in the town. How much they got out into the Panhandle and down near East Springs. Well, they had horse and buggy, and I'm sure they made rounds, but that's the level of what passed for professional medical care that was available in a place like Lancaster, which is, I imagine, pretty typical of the rest of the state. Okay. The next background factor is a tradition of individualism and self-reliance, which still is around today, but nothing like it was through most of our history. This tradition mandated that governments be small, taxes be low, and social services be minimal. And we're still living with the legacy of that. The allocation of funds for things like hospital, public sanitation, all-weather roads and schools, it just wasn't there. The politicians could raise their hands and say, I'm sorry, I'd like to help you with this problem. We don't have the revenue. We can't print money here. We can't do anything about it. And it sort of, I think it sort of created almost a fatalistic sense of, well, this is the reality we live with here. You know, this is not Massachusetts. This is not New York. Next is a suspicion of new ideas, especially if introduced by outsiders. combined with a defensiveness about being criticized by outsiders. All this, I think, is heightened by the Civil War and the defeat in that war, and the legacy of bitterness that many whites still carried around into the next generation. So don't tell me, fancy Massachusetts doctor, that we've got a health problem in our cotton mills. You know, quote Jesus, take the mote out of your own eye before you, what is it? Take the log out of your own eye before you start messing with the mote in my eye. You know, you got problems too. Go back where you came from. So when a study is done of something like hookworm or pellagra, if you're following me now, you can probably anticipate where I'm going with this. Deny. It's not a problem, or if it is, it's beyond anyone's ability to do anything about it. Well, no, it wasn't. But those who were concerned about it got pushback. I'll tell you two little anecdotes. How we doing? Uh-oh. A federal zoologist named Charles Stiles estimated in 1910 that about 30% of farm families coming to cotton mills to work carried hookworms into that mill environment. Hookworm larvae enter the body through open cuts, usually in the feet of people going barefoot, where animals have gone to the bathroom, mostly young children, and they were noticed first in the cotton mill villages. Cotton dust itself was suspected as the cause. Turned out no. The victims were described as pale and listless, with vacant stares, winged shoulder blades. A boy of 14 with a 7-year-old physique and a 30-year-old face was considered the typical cotton mill child. Now, whether that child was suffering from hookworm or not, I can't tell you, but 30% of them were thought to be suffering from that. When northern newspapers began labeling this disease, quote, the germ of laziness, Southerners took offense, and the do-gooders were accused of actually laying the foundation for a shoe sale campaign. Don't you love that? That could have actually been true, I suppose. The remedy came in the form of thymol, an antiseptic derived from thyme oil, but mill owners showed no interest in attracting negative attention to their mill by hosting or funding treatment centers, at least until World War I. World War I did a lot to heighten awareness of health in general, because you've got men being given physical exams for admission to the armed forces, and many of them are failing, and all of a sudden, whoa, we had no idea that we've got this problem. Oh yeah, right. The famous Spanish flu, as it was called. Well, eventually the hookworm problem is addressed and brought under control. By 1915, South Carolina reported 2/3 drop in the number of cases, thanks to the treatment, and also the installation of modern privies in our rural areas. Now, we know what an outhouse is, right? Can you imagine not even having that? We're not talking about indoor plumbing, not even having an outhouse. There's your hookworm environment right there. Okay, pellagra. Pellagra is a dramatic illustration of the health consequences of the cotton mill boom and the mentality of our political leaders regarding their citizens' health problems. This disease, which was unknown in the United States until about 1705, was diagnosed in South Carolina in 1907 at the state mental hospital. People were being brought there and, if you will, dumped on the doorstep of the state mental hospital. This person is out of control, it's whatever. And so they did medical exams, and they knew that there was something wrong with these people, and it was diagnosed as this strange thing called pellagra. The number of cases grew during the 1910s and teens. By the late 20s, it struck some 200,000 people around the South of both races about equal. The symptoms were the 4 Ds: diarrhea, dermatitis, dementia, and death. Now, relatively few people died, but even those who survived did not have a pleasant experience. It was especially found among the poor, and in particular, the cotton mill villages. Several theories arose as to its cause, but finally, a doctor named Joseph Goldberger, the epidemiologist for the U.S. Public Health Service, did a study of cotton mill villages around Spartanburg, and he found that a dietary deficiency was the cause. And the remedy was brewer's yeast, which contains niacin. And that was the key. In other words, these people weren't eating right. And why were they not eating right? They didn't make enough money to be able to go out and shop for what would be considered a healthy diet. But personally, I think that even more, it was their ignorance. They didn't understand the whole concept of food being unhealthy and other food being healthy. And we know today about food deserts, grocery store deserts, where it's hard for people who live in lower income housing or parts of town, even to get to places where they can get fresh fruits and vegetables. But that was what they needed. Their diets were deficient, and well, it was the old molasses, pork, grits, maybe some beans. Beans is about, you read the interviews with cotton mill folks from the early 20th century, pinto beans, any kind of beans. We love that. Vegetables, they actually didn't care for. I didn't know this until I got into the study, but at least until fairly recent times, Black people didn't like vegetables. One Black person actually said, vegetables is white people's food. Well, if that's true, then we need to consider, we can do something about that. Okay, both of those diseases dramatize not only the poor health, the vulnerability to disease in our poor populations, but also the sort of nonchalant.
What did you say about the beans? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Beans was a common part of the diet. Think about this, the typical, okay, a series of facts leading to a conclusion. First, the first generation of cotton mill owners who really were launching this movement about 1880, their business model was based upon a pay scale of 40% below New England's pay scale. That's the only way we compete. If we pay the same amount they pay, we can't win because they know all about it and we don't. We've got a learning curve here and our people have got to learn. So we're offering 40% less. That was not a problem in terms of getting enough workers. There were people beating down the doors. We'll take that. In fact, these people probably didn't even realize that they were being paid so much less than the New England folks. They were desperate. And that's the reason that the cotton mill project worked. But you're paying less. As a result, more than one family member needs to work to have a family wage. There were actually more females than males in most mills, women and girls. And I think maybe we've got a picture somewhere. I know the picture now, the guy in our picture is a boy. If you watch the little video, okay, I'm going to mention the video now. The link to, what is it? Is it the Native American Center link or the Aris Foundation?
Well, they'll send it through the chat on Zoom.
I'm sorry?
They'll send it through the chat.
Okay. You're registered for this. You're going to get something that that you can watch this little 3-minute video, and it includes a photograph taken in Springsville by a famous photographer who was traveling around incognito, pretending to be things like Bible salesman, whatever he can make up, and getting into the mills and taking pictures to show that there are such small children working in this mill, that child labor in mills is not a myth, it's a reality. It was a necessity, is what I'm telling you. Families could not figure out how to survive without their children working. Now, imagine a husband who works the 7 to 4, a wife who works the 4 to 12, probably not a third shift at that point in time, children taking turns working intermittently. If the state passes a law mandating attendance in public schools What's this family going to say? We can't afford it. Now, I don't want my 7-year-old working there, but as soon as they get to be 10 or 11, they're old enough to work in the mill. And that's all the learning they need. There was not compulsory school attendance in the state until right around World War I, but even when it passed, it was not well enforced. One statistic I saw said that the average school year in the state was 4 months. Now, even if you're there every day, 4 months is less than half what we think is necessary now. Here's another shocking statistic. The state of South Carolina did not fund a single high school until about 1905. So where did our high schools come from? Number one, there were very few of them. Number two, they were all private. Churches and northern philanthropists. I'll mention one name in particular. Rosenwald. You ever heard of the Rosenwald schools? Julius Rosenwald was the CEO of Sears Roebuck in Chicago. And he started learning about the lack of educational opportunities in the South, and he created this Rosenwald Fund, which set up a matching program. If a community would match dollar for dollar, he would give you several hundred, and you could build a very small school, maybe 2 rooms, maybe 3. You see pictures of these online, they're all over the place. There were hundreds of them in South Carolina, and from what I found, there were 12 right here in Lancaster County. I don't think any of them survived. For one thing, once the public education really got going on a larger scale, the Rosenwald schools sort of fell by the side. But state-funded public education in this state is a shockingly modern phenomenon. Okay, I've gotten off the track, haven't I? All right. Okay, the second, we're already into the second decision, but the second decision was that South Carolina should abandon its overwhelmingly agricultural economy and go to a mixed economy of industry and agriculture. And what more logical industry to go into than textiles, since we are one of the largest cotton growing states in the country. And we know how to do that. And the distance from the field to the factory is going to be much less than selling it and having to ship it to New England or across the ocean to England. This was a controversial decision because the elite of this state up until the Civil War was married to the idea of agriculture, slave labor or free labor. Everybody farmed, and it was a superior way of life. Factories involve cities. Cities involve slums. Slums involve crime. Thomas Jefferson, probably the best example of somebody who made that argument. Let our factories remain in Europe, Jefferson had said long ago. We were turning our back on that notion by building these factories. And the risks that we were taking was that we might create what came to be called the mill problem. I don't have time to do much more than just, I'll stop with this. The mill problem was the question of what is going to happen in this state if we take tens of thousands of rural sharecroppers and tenant farmers, bring them into a small housing community, put them to work in the mill. They have no experience in communal living. They are like, well, I'll use the term that one mill owner used, they are like children. They need supervision. They need instruction. They need rules. And we're going to impose rules on them. The whistle or the bell is going to ring right on time every morning. It shocked me to read also that in many cases, the people were not just coming in, the bell or whistle rang, they were waiting outside the locked gate 15, 20 minutes early. We're afraid not to be on time. You would be docked. The little pay you got if you weren't there on time. Regimentation is what we're talking about. In their minds, they were not doing anything cruel to do this. It was necessary. You can't expect people who come from a long line of farmers to just flick a switch and become good industrial workers and get along with their neighbors when they've really never dealt with neighbors. Well, it was a wonderful opportunity, especially for the women. They liked being able to go up and down the street and get to know people, gossip, if you don't mind that word. And it was good for the guys too. On the weekend, they would gather in bars, beer parlors, pool halls, and, you know, tell jokes and have fun with their buddies. It was a way of life that, although we may look down on, actually had some redeeming features to it in the eyes of the people who were doing it. And if you ever ask them, don't you think you'd rather do something else? What was the answer? What else could I do? I don't know anything else. I don't want to go back to the farm, although some actually did get disgusted with mill work and try farming again. Usually they came on back. By the second or third generation, these families, none of those people wanted to ever go back to farming. They were now, if you will, programmed into the mill culture. And at least it was a pay envelope every week or every 2 weeks, unlike farming where you really don't know if the weather's going to cooperate, what the price of cotton is going to be, and so forth. And I promise you I'd stop for questions. So much to say, so little time, but I'll stop.